Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back. We're going to be diving into some tight ends today. It's going to be wrapping up our video series on fantasy prospects this year, or fantasy rankings this year. Tight end is the last position we're hitting, and also potentially the most intriguing because it's definitely the thinnest position in terms of depth, like fantasy option depth this year. Easily the thinnest position. I don't even think that's a debate. But also perhaps some of the best values that you're going to find later in the draft. So it's a very interesting position to talk about because everybody has wildly different thoughts on how to approach tight end this year. So let's kind of start off just by going over the brand names, the ones everybody knows and trusts, and that's starting with Rob Gronkowski. I've got him as a third-round pick. A lot of people have him as a second-round pick. And usually the people that advocate for him in the second round are arguing that because tight end is so thin, you want somebody who is reliable, who you know what you're getting, who can be a points monster any given week. And, if you have a great tight end, it's an advantage over most other opponents because there's not a lot of great tight ends to choose from. I would counter that by saying it's Rob Gronkowski and you can never guarantee he's going to play a whole season. So while, yes, he is the best tight end in the league, he's the most talented tight end in the league, he's probably going to get force-fed a bunch of targets when he's healthy, you can't really guarantee he's going to play the whole season. So I personally, I would rather go with a running back or a receiver in round 2 and then maybe hope he slips to me in round 3. But if not, I'm not sweating it because a second-round pick is an awful lot to invest into a tight end that you can't guarantee he's going to be durable for the whole year. So yes, he's a points monster. Yes, it's a thin position, and it's valuable to have a points monster at a thin position. But it just there's been so many injuries throughout his career that it just kind of spooks me a little bit. Not guaranteeing he's going to get injured. I'm not saying I think he's going to get injured. I'm just saying it's a possibility, and that's kind of what determines his value for me. So in round 3, I also have another guy who is maybe not quite as big and physical, but overall I think is a very similar talent level, similar production level. That's going to be Zach Ertz. He's going to get a ton of targets, probably just as many as Gronkowski. He's probably the best passing weapon on that team in Philadelphia. He's got an elite quarterback just like Gronk does, a great play caller just like Gronk does. So, and also he's not as injury prone as Gronk has been throughout his career. He's been nicked up a little bit, but certainly not as much as Gronk. So, you could argue that Ertz is the safer option of the two. Maybe not as high of a ceiling, but certainly safer. Maybe a higher floor just on injury history. But when debating the two, it is like saying, okay, do I want Antonio Brown or Odell Beckham? Like you can't really go wrong with either one of them. So those are my two kind of top tier round 3 tight ends. And whether or not you draft them, it doesn't necessarily come down to how I rank them compared to all the other players on my board. It really just comes down to philosophy about whether or not you want to pull the trigger on an early tight end and kind of give yourself that leg up over teams that maybe don't have as consistent of options later in the draft, or if you kind of want to play the value game and gamble a little bit. Both options are perfectly valid. You can take either strategy. Personally, I tend to wait on tight end because I like to invest in running backs early, but that's just me. Like, I totally get if you want to draft a tight end early. I'm not knocking that. And obviously their grades on my board kind of reflect that. Just my personal opinion is I tend to wait on tight end. Now, moving on to Travis Kelce, I've got him one round later in round 4. He's kind of that tier 1B to the Gronk and Ertz tier 1A. You could argue that he's more physically talented than Ertz, but his situation, and I've mentioned this before when talking about Tyreek Hill and Sammy Watkins and Kareem Hunt and Pat Mahomes. Like, Pat Mahomes is kind of what determines the value of everybody on the Chiefs offense. So if it was still Alex Smith there, maybe I would have him in that round 3 category of like, here's the rock solid tight ends you can rely on. And if you're going to reach on one, not reach, but if you're going to take one early, it would be one of those 3 guys. But since Alex Smith is no longer there, I kind of have to knock him a little bit because we still don't really know what we're getting with Pat Mahomes. So I'm kind of keeping with the theme of all the other Chiefs skill positions skill position players that I've laid out earlier of I kind of subtract around from their value until we know a little bit more about their quarterback situation. Camp reports about Pat Mahomes have not been positive, but at the same time, it's training camp, and there's a lot of situations in training camp where Andy Reid is just kind of giving him a tough situation and saying, go execute, let's see what you can do. And I wouldn't put too much stock into it because like they're intentionally making training camp hard on him to prepare him for the regular season. So it's not that big of a deal that he's struggling, but it's still something to pay attention to that he is struggling. So, but really, I'm not knocking Travis Kelce down around because of Mahomes struggling in training camp. I'm knocking him down just because we don't know if Mahomes is not going to struggle in the regular season. And until we kind of get a better idea of what he is, and we'll kind of get that throughout the preseason, until we get a better idea of what Mahomes is as a quarterback, I'm subtracting a little bit of value from all these Chiefs weapons. So that applies to Kelce. Phenomenally gifted tight end. I mean, when he's on the field, he's been banged up a couple times in his career, but again, not much. But when he's on the field and he's got a good connection with his quarterback, I mean, he's as good as any tight end in the league. So again, not knocking him personally, just knocking the situation. And then round 5, we have 2 very different tight ends at different stages of their careers. In my first rankings, if you've been on my Patreon, you've seen my first rankings, I had Greg Olsen above Evan Ingram, but I kind of flip-flopped them last week after watching a whole bunch of Giants offense on tape in preparation for that Giants-Jags film room episode I just released a few days ago. You guys probably saw that. If not, you can go check that out. It's definitely a big one. And I did a lot of film study on Evan Ingram in preparation for that episode because I kind of wanted to get a sense of how they were going to use him. In particular, like how they were going to match him up with Tayshaun Gibson, who's kind of their main man coverage specialist on tight ends. And, just as I was watching film in preparation for that episode, I ended up not really using it, but just watching it. I mean, this kid is unbelievable. Like, he is unbelievable. He is so freaking talented. Runs like a deer, jumps out the gym, great hands. I mean, he had some concentration drops, yes, but I mean, man, when he's posting up on DBs, you can't stop him. I mean, he had one of the best rookie seasons for a tight end ever, and that was with a piss-poor offensive line, a terrible play caller, pretty much no other passing options around him because everybody kept getting hurt. Sterling Shepard, I think, played most of the games as wide receiver, but I don't think even he was healthy for the whole year. So, like, he was pretty much the only guy on that offense for a significant stretch of the season that was a legitimate threat. And I mean, God, everybody was double teaming him. Like, everybody was double teaming him. And this was a rookie tight end, and they were more scared of him than they were of everybody else on that offense, especially after Odell went down. So he is truly an incredible talent. I think he's too fast for safeties. Too big for safeties, too fast for linebackers. Like, unless you have a freakishly athletic linebacker or safety of your own, like Eric Berry when he's healthy, or potentially Tremaine Edmonds over in Buffalo. I don't think they're even playing this year, but those kind of like elite physical freaks that can take those kind of threats away. Like, unless you have one of those guys that can match up with Evan Ingram's freakiness, like, you're not going to stop him. He's an absolute monster. So I expect a big year from him. And then Olsen, he's on the backside of his career. He's kind of the opposite of Ingram, where he maybe doesn't have the same twitch that he used to. He used to be one of the most athletic tight ends in the league. Now he's kind of slowly morphing into kind of that old man Jason Witten, beat you more with technique and route running and feel in between zones than just outright physical gifts. But man, he's got great chemistry with Cam Newton. They're going to throw a lot in Carolina this year, especially because I don't expect they're going to be able to run the ball that well. Schematically, I think they're going to be better in terms of how they scheme their run game, but they've had so many injuries in the offensive line. I mean, 3 already, and then obviously they lost Norwell in free agency, so like the offensive line is not looking good. Definitely in much worse shape than when I did the Panthers offense film room episode like 5 weeks ago or whatever that was. So I'm pretty worried about that run game, but it means they're going to end up passing more because they're going to have to. So I think Olsen's going to benefit from that because he's going to get a ton of targets. Again, he's got great chemistry with Newton. He's a great route runner. If you play zone defense against Carolina Panthers, Olsen's going to find the soft spot and he's going to convert first downs, just like Jason Witten used to do with Tony Romo. When somebody is that smart and that technically proficient, like, sometimes it maybe doesn't matter as much, like, how much juice they still have. Like, they're still going to be productive. We've seen that a lot over the years with veteran tight ends, so I'm not super worried about him. You could argue that durability is a concern, yes, but as long as he's on the field and as long as the Panthers are throwing as much as I expect them to, like, he's going to be very, very, very productive. A very high floor for him, again, as long as he's healthy. So, that kind of rounds out the top 5. And then we got Delanie Walker, who's just on the outside looking in at number 6. He's really more of like a 5B to Olsen's 5A. You could argue either way for either one of them. But again, he's kind of like that veteran tight end, maybe not as much juice as he used to have, but I mean, he catches everything that you throw at him. He's a great route runner. He's a great blocker, and he's in a system, I think, that really benefits tight ends. Again, I broke down the Titans offense before I broke down the Panthers offense, and I talked a little bit about how it's going to benefit Walker. In particular, when they're running a whole bunch of outside zone and they're booting off the backside, like tight ends are usually one of the best beneficiaries of that. And we've seen that over the years in the Shanahan system, in the Gruden system, and in the McVay system, which, I mean, they're all kind of offshoots of the same overarching tree. But LaFleur comes from that tutelage. He comes from that system. So everywhere all those guys have gone, tight ends have been productive. Tight ends have been involved in the play-action pass game, and I expect it to be the same in Tennessee. So when Marcus is booting off the backside of that zone run game, I expect Walker to be the guy that's in the shallow cross. Maybe sometimes he'll get the deep cross if Corey Davis is running like a clear out route on the backside. So like he's going to get a bunch of room for big yardage after catch opportunities, and I expect him to benefit from that a lot. Whether or not he gets used in the red zone as much compared to the running backs, I'm not sure. That's part of the reason why I have him in round 6 instead of round 5. Because tight ends are kind of hit and miss in the red zone in this kind of system. But in terms of just catches and yardage and reliability of getting points week after week, like Walker, I think is going to be one of the more stable options you can get in the middle rounds. So I'm pretty big on him this year. And then round 7, I don't have anybody. That's kind of like the dead zone this year of tight ends. Like I couldn't really find anybody that I felt comfortable with in round 7. Rudolph was close, but even then I was kind of looking at the options that I had for other positions in round 7. I was like, I would much rather have pretty much every name at any other position compared to Kyle Rudolph in round 7. So I just put him at the top of round 8. And again, I love his situation. Kirk Cousins is a good quarterback. Not a great quarterback, but a good quarterback. He's got 2 excellent receivers that potentially could be drawing a little bit of attention away from him. It kind of depends on the system they're playing against. And he's not super quick, but I think he's a savvy enough route runner that if people kind of match size for size and put linebackers on him, he can win there as well. Really, it just comes down to whether or not Kirk Cousins is favoring him versus favoring Diggs and Thielen. It's kind of like a pick your poison offense. I mean, they got Dalvin Cook there too. So you could argue that maybe he suffers a little bit from too many mouths to feed syndrome, but at the same time, it's a benefit because he's going to be like the 4th guy that defenses focus on. So he's not going to get that much attention. So it kind of works both ways there. But I think he's got very reliable hands. He's a good, reliable red zone target. And I think while maybe not putting up elite numbers, there's a lot worse options you could get as your starting tight end than Kyle Rudolph. So I think he's a very solid round 8 pick. Trey Burton is a little bit more of an unknown right behind him, but very, very high ceiling. Very, very athletic, super versatile. He kind of reminds me of like a young Delanie Walker, to be honest. So I really do like his skill set. Similar to Rudolph, he kind of suffers from too many mouths to feed syndrome in Chicago because they've got Allen Robinson and Tariq Cohen, and obviously Jordan Howard's going to be getting 20 carries a game. They got the young slot receiver Anthony Miller, who's going to be probably getting a bunch of third down targets. So like there's a lot of options. Oh, and Taylor Gabriel too. I forgot about him. So there's a lot of options in Chicago that might get targets ahead of Burton. But again, tight end is so thin that you might as well take a shot on a high upside guy, because there's not that much behind him that you feel safe with anyway. Like, pretty much once you get past Delanie Walker, like, it's all up in the air. So you might as well gamble on a guy who potentially is a pretty big ceiling. Really good yards after catch threat. Again, he's versatile, so you know he's going to be on the field a lot. It's just a matter of how many targets you believe he's going to get. And as we go through the preseason, as we go through the first month of the season, we'll monitor that because we don't really know what the offense is totally going to look like yet. We have an idea, but we don't know 100% yet. So I think the ceiling is very high. The floor might be a little bit lower, but the ceiling is certainly very high, and I think that justifies a round 8 investment. And then just behind him, I got Jimmy Graham, who it qualifies as one of those older, slower veteran tight ends at this point in his career. Not necessarily because he's super old, but just kind of the injuries have added up where he doesn't really have the same juice he used to. Most of his points are just purely relying on red zone targets. I don't think he has the same twitch he used to as a route runner. I think if you get him on like a shallow cross and he's got a bunch of grass in front of him, he can build up speed and kind of be a big play threat in that regard. But like he's going to be relying mostly on like back shoulder fades, like fades in the red zone, really high, like well-placed balls up in the seam that he can go up and get. But, he's going to be relying a lot on Aaron Rodgers to force feed him really well-placed passes that he can go up and just use his size to kind of box people out and go get them. Because I don't think he's going to be running away from anybody deep downfield. So, again, there is value in a tight end that's going to get double-digit touchdowns, or at the very least, potentially double-digit touchdowns. He won't get much beyond that, because I think between the 20s, it's going to be the wide receivers and the running backs that do most of the work. But in the red zone, that's going to be his domain, and there's not a lot of tight ends that get double-digit touchdowns these days. So he's valuable just because of that. And again, he's going to be boom or bust from week to week, but tight end is super thin. You don't really have any other options. So if you want somebody who's a little bit more reliable, draft a tight end earlier. If not, well, you got Jimmy Graham. That's just kind of how it is this year. But anyway, moving on to round 9, and here's where we start to get to the value picks that I'm really focusing on in George Kittle and David Njoku, and that's who I'm focusing on for most of my teams, because I'm tending to forego tight end early in exchange for these value picks that I think are going to be very high upside value picks later in the draft. It's riskier, yes, and I understand a lot of people are not going to be comfortable with that risk, but that's just how I'm drafting this year in particular. But Kittle and Njoku I have in the same category. And Kittle in particular, I think he's a huge weapon for that San Francisco offense under Kyle Shanahan. I talked a little bit about it when I was talking about Walker. Like every offense in this tree is very productive for tight ends. Like they tend to prioritize tight ends because they have so many bootlegs. It's very play action heavy, and tight ends, when they're running that shallow cross off the bootleg, like it's open 8 times out of 10. So he's going to get a bunch of targets just from that alone. He's going to get a bunch of yardage after catch opportunities. I mean, even against the Jags, like they were formulating plays specifically to get the ball to him against the Jags, because that's just how their offense works. Like they know that tight ends are a big mismatch problem for this offense just because of how they use them and how they move them around and how they get them open in space. So I'm very confident that Kyle Shanahan is going to feed him the ball a lot, especially because they don't really have a true like stud X receiver that Shanahan usually has relied on in the past. Pierre Garçon is their X this year, who maybe I was a little bit lower on Garçon than I should have been in my wide receiver rankings. Like, I acknowledge I probably should have been higher on him. He's going to get a bunch of targets, but he's not Julio Jones. He's not prime Andre Johnson. He's not even prime Pierre Garçon that Shanahan had back in Washington. Or I think he had Josh Gordon as well when he was in Cleveland. Was that the same year? Gordon might have been suspended that year. Shanahan might have been there. I can't remember. But either way, anywhere Shanahan's been, there's always been that kind of stud X receiver that he's always fed the ball to. But that's not really the case in San Francisco. Garçon is much older. He doesn't really have the same juice he used to. He's still a very technically proficient receiver, but he's not the guy that's going to be getting 110 to 115 catches like he used to in this system. Like, some of those targets are going to have to go elsewhere, and I think Kittle is going to be a big beneficiary of that. I think he's very physically gifted. Maybe not the elite twitch of Ingram or Kelce or Ertz or Gronk, but he as far as tight ends go, he's still very physically gifted. He's got great size. I think he's an underrated route runner. He's got underrated hands, and he's a pretty good blocker too, so he's going to get a bunch of snaps. And Kittle, I think, is just kind of in that do-it-all young tight end category with Hunter Henry, who unfortunately, he would be on this list if he was healthy, but obviously he's out for the year. But, Kittle and Henry are kind of in the same category of young do-it-all tight ends that within the next 2 or 3 years, I think we're going to see them ascend and become kind of part of that new generation of top-tier tight ends. So Kittle is definitely super valuable in dynasty leagues, but he's valuable this year in redraft leagues as well, just because of his role in this offense and where I think this offense is going to go. Njoku is he's similar but different, if that makes sense, where he's definitely more gifted than Kittle physically. The situation is a little bit more unstable, though. Whereas Kittle has a defined role in an offense that he's going to be featured in, you can't really trust any of the Browns' receiving options because you don't really know what you're getting 100% with that offense. I like the quarterback situation a lot better this year than I did last year. The offensive line is definitely concerning. I mean, they moved their left guard to left tackle because they had nobody else. So, like, the offense, I still don't expect them to be good, but they're going to have to throw the ball to somebody. And Njoku is one of their best matchup options on the team since Josh Gordon's no longer there. I mean, they shipped off Corey Coleman, who wasn't great, but I mean, still they shipped him off. So their number 2 receiver is still, I guess, Antonio Callaway since Gordon's gone. So like they're going to be lining up day 1 with Jarvis Landry and Antonio Callaway. So like they're going to have to throw to somebody, and I feel like Njoku is going to be a beneficiary of that. He's a matchup weapon where you put him outside, you split him out, and if there's a safety on him, he's too big and jumps too high for the safety to stop him if you're throwing back shoulder balls. And he's too fast for a linebacker to cover one-on-one as well. So as long as the quarterback situation is not great, but as long as, Tyrod Taylor doesn't totally screw it up, and as long as Baker Mayfield doesn't totally screw it up whenever he inevitably starts, and as long as the offensive line, again, I don't expect the offensive line to be good, but as long as the offensive line doesn't get those quarterbacks killed, Njoku should be fairly productive. Certainly a very high upside option just because of his physical talents, but the situation is vastly inferior to, say, George Kittle. So, that's why I have Kittle ranked ahead of Njoku, but like both of them are very, very, very good plays for Dynasty and very high upside plays for redraft. Kittle is just safer. So I understand why people might stay away from Njoku because, it's the Browns and yada, yada, yada. Like, we don't trust the Browns, which I get. But they got to throw to somebody. Like they have to throw the ball to somebody. They're going to be behind in a bunch of games. Like, they're going to have to air it out. And Njoku's going to be one of the guys to get those targets. It's going to be him and Duke Johnson and Jarvis Landry that are going to be the biggest target monsters on that team. Unless Josh Gordon comes back week 1, which we have no idea when he's coming back. So I can't even remotely project that. But, somebody's going to get the yards. It might as well be Njoku. But moving on, Jordan Reed, who used to be an elite fantasy tight end option, and I feel like when he's healthy, he's still an elite fantasy tight end option, but he's never healthy. So that's why I have him at round 10 because, even more so than Gronkowski, like, when can you possibly rely on Jordan Reed to play all 16 games? Or at least expect him to play all 16 games? I certainly don't. Like, I expect him to miss 3 or 4 games this year because that's just what Jordan Reed does. And it's not knocking him as a player. He's very athletically gifted. He was Evan Ingram before Evan Ingram. Like, that's who everybody compared Evan Ingram to coming out of college, was Jordan Reed. Like, they're basically the same dude. Reed just happens to be injured every year. So, with Alex Smith there, and I feel like in their kind of new ball control offense, a lot of play action passes, like, Reed theoretically should be a huge benefactor of that, and maybe has a higher upside than both of the guys I have ahead of him in round 9. And all things being equal, I would take him ahead of Kittle and Njoku in round 9, but I can't rely on him to stay healthy. So that's why I have him below that. Like, I don't want to predict injuries, but with Reed, it's pretty predictable. He's like the Sam Bradford of tight ends. Like, he's going to get hurt. Actually, Tyler Eifert's probably the Sam Bradford of tight ends, but Jordan Reed's a close second in terms of predictable injuries. So if you're taking him, like, I have him as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So I have him as my last tight end 1. But I don't feel good about it. Like, if I'm drafting Jordan Reed, like, I'm planning on eventually having to stream tight ends for the rest of the year because I don't expect him to be healthy. So if you're drafting him as your tight end 1 in the later part of the draft, just plan for the eventuality that you're going to have to take somebody else, or you're going to have to drop him, or you're going to have to IR him, or if you have a big enough bench, you can keep another tight end on the bench, just assuming he's going to get hurt. So just plan for that. He's a very high upside player, but the downside is equally bad. So just be ready for that. And then round 11 plus, these are all the tight end 2s that you're going to be keeping on your bench. If you have the bench space available, obviously it kind of depends on your league format, but these are all the guys that you're going to be keeping on your bench just in case that, Reed gets hurt or Njoku falls flat, or, Burton maybe isn't getting as used as much as we think he is, or maybe, you're going up against a defense with one of these tight end 2s that is notorious for giving up a ton of yardage to tight ends, and it's kind of a juicier matchup. Like, unless you have one of those top 6 or 7 tight ends, nobody is irreplaceable. like pretty much after Delanie Walker, or actually, pretty much after Kyle Rudolph, you can swap out any of those remaining tight end ones pretty much any given week if there's a better matchup on your bench. So, that's where we get into kind of tight end streaming territory. And that's where, again, if your bench is big enough, you're going to be keeping one of these tight end twos on your bench as your kind of fill-in option if they have a better matchup. And these are just kind of rankings from top to bottom of guys that I would prefer to have on my bench as either, throw-in options or streaming options, that kind of stuff. So O.J. Howard is easily the most talented of this group, but I'm not particularly a big fan of his situation. He's not going to have Jameis Winston for the first few games, and Ryan Fitzpatrick is notorious for completely ignoring tight ends. So I don't expect him or Cameron Brate to be productive at all the first 3 weeks. And then once Jameis gets back, I'm not a super big fan of the run game or of the offensive line or even, Jameis Winston. He's kind of had his ups and downs as well. So, I'm not a big fan of the situation overall. Phenomenally gifted tight end, and Winston, there's potential that he can kind of grow past what he has been so far, which is really just kind of an average quarterback. There's potential for improvement there. There's potential for the situation to get better, but just based on what we know now, Howard and Brate are not in the best situation. Whereas if they were, if Howard was, let's say he was in Philadelphia instead of Zach Ertz, he's as talented as Zach Ertz. He could put up numbers like Zach Ertz, but he's not in that situation, so I kind of got to hold it against him. And then after that, I got Ryan Griffin in Houston. Not the most talented tight end in the world, but it's a good situation. I mean, Deshaun Watson, I think, is a phenomenal quarterback. Bill O'Brien is a good play caller. There's a ton of talent around him. Offensive line is a concern, but with Deshaun Watson's mobility, I think he's able to kind of play around that and kind of compensate for a terrible offensive line and still get the ball to his playmakers. We saw that a lot last year with Griffin. They had a pretty good connection in the time that Watson was healthy. So again, he's a fairly decently high upside tight end 2 that you can throw in for a juicy matchup if you don't like the matchup for your tight end 1. Jack Doyle, same kind of thing. With Andrew Luck coming back, maybe potentially healthy. Doyle's a guy who fairly high upside for a tight end 2. If you got a juicy matchup, feel free to throw him in. Tyler Eifert, just like Jordan Reed, when he's healthy, is phenomenal. He's super productive, great chemistry with Dalton. We don't really know what he's got left, juice-wise, just after all these injuries, but if you have a deep bench, if you have space for another tight end on your bench, he's definitely worth a roster spot just because of the upside, especially if he stays healthy. Luke Wilson, Austin Hooper, Austin Seferian-Jenkins, Vance McDonald, Mike Gesicki, Cameron Brate, they're all kind of the same thing. I touched on Brate already. Gesicki's definitely a high upside rookie, but again, he's a rookie tight end, and very rarely are rookie tight ends super productive. It's like a maybe one a year. And Gesicki probably has the best chance to be that one a year this year, but you can't really project it and rely on it. But all those guys they're basically just streaming options. And this just goes to show the thinness of the position. If you don't have one of those top 6 or 7 tight ends, those are the names you're going to have to rely on for streaming options. And, God forbid somebody gets hurt. If Greg Olsen goes down again or Rob Gronkowski goes down again, those are the guys you have to rely on to fill in once your main star tight end goes down. So, that's how thin we're talking about here. It's not pretty. And that's the argument for why you take a tight end early, is you don't want to deal with that streaming nonsense because you really don't know what you're getting out of those guys. It's some of them just aren't very talented. Some of them are in terrible positions. Unless you have those premium tight ends, you really don't know what you're getting every single week. So I understand the anxiety and the apprehensiveness about dealing with that kind of toss of the dice every single week, and that's why people flock to Gronkowski in round 2. But at the same time, I'm personally comfortable with Kittle in round 9. I'm comfortable with Njoku and now not in round 9. It just comes down to personal preference. I'm okay with rolling that dice because I have confidence in my ability to stream properly. Some people don't want to deal with it. I'm cool with dealing with it, but it just comes down to how you approach your league, how your league is formatted, how many bench spots you have. There's no one answer fits all when it comes to the tight end position. It's probably the most nuanced position in fantasy football this year because there's so many different factors that go into it, just because there's so few resources to go around. So It's very much a case-by-case basis. You're going to have to make the decision for yourself. These are how I have them ranked, but by no means do you have to take all these guys in these rounds, because every league is way different. Every league is treating tight ends way different. So just kind of use this as a general guideline for maybe how I project their talent and their situation, but not necessarily like where they have to go in the draft. Like, you don't have to follow this. Just kind of follow your gut as you're drafting, and you'll be okay. So that wraps it up for tight ends. That wraps it up for our position rankings reviews for all these different positions for this year. If you want updates to my fantasy rankings every single week throughout the preseason, there is going to be a little bit of movement in tight ends, maybe not as much as some other positions. There's going to be a lot of movement in receivers and running backs. I can almost guarantee you that. But if you want those updates every single week to these rankings, those are going to be available on my Patreon page exclusively for all patrons to this channel. It doesn't matter how much you give. It can be as low as $1 or $5, $10. Whatever you want to give, you can pay whatever you want. It's totally up to you. And you get access to the initial rankings. You get access to all of the updates that I'm posting every single week. You get access to the patron-only Q&A sessions where you can ask anything about fantasy or schemes or players or coaches or anything about myself. Whatever you want to ask, you can ask. I just had a Q&A last week, but you can still post questions in there, and I'll answer them, of course. And during the season, I'll have a whole bunch of game picks, weekly game picks, that is. I'll have some daily fantasy stuff. So, yeah, a whole lot coming to Patreon, even more coming to the channel, on this channel, starting next week. I've got a whole bunch of film study coming out, more fantasy-oriented, but it's still hardcore film study, looking at techniques and traits and matchups and schemes and all that kind of stuff. So I think you're going to really like that. It's a collaboration with my buddy Chris Harris, who, again, is a fellow film watcher. Most of you guys know him, know his work. We have pretty big overlap in our audiences, but I think you guys are going to like that a lot. But I think we have like 11 or 12 episodes coming out over the course of the next few weeks, so it's a lot. You guys are in store for a lot. There's going to be new stuff pretty much every day. So hopefully you enjoy all that, and until then, I'll see you guys next week. Later.